It ain't the left side or the right side, then it must be the FinSide. It ain't the left
Thank you,
side.
Solo D. Welcome to another episode of On the FinSide here with Kat and Paul. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Spreaker, iTunes, YouTube, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. I am Brian Cat NFL. Paul is Fanatic_Pick. It is the final game of the season. We are finally here, and the Dolphins are 4-11, going to Foxborough to face the 12-3 New England Patriots. Temperatures are expected to be in the low 40s. Patriots are favored by 16 points. And it's real simple for both teams. The Dolphins are fighting for draft position. The Bengals are locked in at number 1. The Dolphins currently pick 5th. And if the Dolphins pull off a stunning upset here against New England, the lowest that they would drop to is 6th. So it actually might be worth rooting for the Dolphins here this weekend. And you look at the rest, and the main thing to focus on as far as value for the Dolphins this week is assuming the Dolphins do lose here, then the Redskins, Lions, or Giants, if any of those teams do pick up a win, the Dolphins would leapfrog one or as many of those teams that lose. For the Patriots, very simple. Win and you have another first round bye, which makes all of us throw up here. But as far as the game's concerned, Paul, you know, we keep going through a couple players every week as the injured reserve continues to build and build for the Dolphins, and as we continue to see more and more players interwoven throughout the team. Who are some players in your mind that can really help or hurt their case and their stock heading into the 2020 season?
So I'm gonna go through those, and then I'm gonna go back to something else that you just said, because I'm absolutely intrigued and want to point it out again for our listeners. But as far as for the 2020 season, you have to look at some of the defensive ends. If Sealer plays again this week, or Seiler, I absolutely was enamored with him last weekend, and he's really that type of guy that can fit into that Brian Flores defense, fit that mold, and you can build that defensive line around a little bit. And now you're looking exclusively for somebody that's a pass rusher and can be that pass rush threat. I loved what I saw from Flores this week, where he basically said, you know, Chase Young falls to you. You've got a generational talent. You change your scheme and build around the talent that you've got. That's what I've said for years on this show. I've said for years before we did this show, I wanted Miami to do. Build around the talent they have. You look at linebacker, I want to see if Sam McGuavin can be that guy. I don't think he can at this point. I think he's a depth guy for this team. You look along the secondary, there's a lot of jobs up for grabs in a set of positions that A, is going to get a few players back next year, and B, they're probably going to add to. If Miami's sitting around 5th or 6th in the draft, they're probably going to be grabbing somebody like an Akuda. And if that's the case, you know, all of a sudden your perimeter is set, and there's a possibility Miami goes after a Byron Jones in free agency, which we'll talk about a lot. So you've got a lot of guys auditioning for less jobs than there are right now. On top of that, you look at the offensive side of the ball. I think Patrick Laird's already got a job for next year as the third down back. But at wide receiver and tight end, you know, anyone not named Gesicki at tight end is auditioning for next year. Anybody not named Devontae Parker that's going to play this Sunday is auditioning for next year. I love Isaiah Ford, but he needs to continue to show what he has. He's a guy that's going to have a job in the NFL next year. Based on what he's shown thus far, he's going to get a little bit of a tryout with somebody if it's not the Dolphins. I want to see more out of him. I love the guy coming out of Virginia Tech. Now that he's finally getting a real opportunity, he's making the most of it. Outside of him, I want to see if Albert Wilson can continue to show he's the player he was last year, who's an exciting, movable piece on that offense, because I think that's something that could really help complete the offense for 2020.
Yeah, and I've got a few players on my list here too. And to go back to something you said, Sam McGuavin there, over the last 2 weeks, I think he's played really well at inside linebacker. I think that over the next couple of years, you're going to see Raekwon McMillan and Jerome Baker starting, but it's good to know that you've got a third inside linebacker that can step in and play at a moment's notice. He's somebody that we've pointed out as somebody who needs to step up over the last couple of weeks, and I think he has. And you also factor in he's 26 years old. He is one of the Dolphins' core special teams players, and he's second on the team in sacks and first if you don't have Taco Charlton on the active roster. I think he certainly has made the team here in 2020. A few other players I look at that need to step up. Linebacker Calvin Munson got on the field last week, played 38 snaps and did pretty well. Also, Evan Brown, 2 weeks ago against the Giants, we were looking at him as somebody that we wanted to see more of, but then didn't get any snaps last week in the Bengals win. I hope he does get on the field. Tay Hayes at cornerback played 67 snaps, much to our surprise, after being picked up a few weeks ago. And we'll see if he takes that next step up, because I also do think Nate Brooks at cornerback played a much, much better game in his second week with the team against the Bengals as opposed to his first week against the Giants. So remember last year in the final game, Jalen Davis finally gets on the field, and I think he played 15 snaps, and he had a forced fumble and a sack and a pass breakup. Didn't make the team the following year because he wasn't a good scheme fit, but is with the Arizona Cardinals right now as their third or fourth cornerback late in the season. So some things to look out for here, Paul. But in terms of what I'm really looking for as far as milestones, Ryan Fitzpatrick needs 291 yards passing for 3,500 for the season. Devontae Parker needs 35 yards for 1,100. Mike Gesicki needs 64 yards for 600. But Devontae Parker, I mean, that might look like a layup for that 35 yards, but last game against Stephon Gilmore in Miami in week 2, Parker had 7 targets, 0 catches. So not exactly a slam dunk that he even gets those 35 yards.
No, not at all. And I want to go back to somebody you pointed out because I completely forgot to mention him. Tay Hayes looked really good last week, and he's somebody I definitely want to see a lot more of in the game this week. One other thing I want to go back to as well. Did you say Miami's worst pick that they could have in this draft is 6th?
I believe so, yes.
I just want to reiterate that for our listeners. Holy crap, let's go. Let's win this game. Let's make the Patriots play 3 playoff games before this, prior to the Super Bowl. I don't see the Patriots as a team that can play 3 playoff caliber teams in a row and then a 4th and win a Super Bowl this year. I don't see them as that team. I think they're a very good team who's not as good as their record. They've played a lot of crap teams, including Miami early on, let's face it. And it's if we can ruin the Pats Super Bowl and not slide terribly in the draft, let's go.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I'm typically all about draft position, but I would have to say the difference between 5th and 6th might be worth the win in my eyes. And I know it is in your eyes. You're up in Patriots country there. Now, on the other hand, if the Dolphins pull off a stunning upset again, I think they're going to get blown out in this game, but say that they do shock us here with Ryan Fitzpatrick at quarterback, then I see the Giants win and the Redskins win, and now I'm thinking, well, damn, now we're picking 6th instead of 3rd. Then I'm going to have a problem with it. And because the Giants and Redskins are playing at 3 o'clock, there's really no way to determine that. So if looking at the rest of the teams here, so you've got the Bengals locked in at number 1. You've got the Redskins at number 2, and they play a home game against the Philadelphia Eagles in a very winnable game. And then as far as the third spot there, you've got the Detroit Lions playing at noon. They're 12.5-point underdogs against the Green Bay Packers. And then again at 4 o'clock, you've got the Giants playing somebody, and the team is escaping me now. And then the Dolphins pick 5th, and then 6th, the Chargers have the ability to leapfrog the Dolphins if they win. And the reason I say I think is because the 7th team, whoever they are, isn't too far off on the strength of schedule. So there's a possibility that I could stand corrected on that. But the lowest the Dolphins would pick is 6th or 7th. Again, if the other teams end up losing, then I think it is worth it for the Dolphins to win this game. But I don't think that they will. Paul, Devontae Parker, what we said, needs 35 yards for 1,100. Mike Gesicki is standing at 536 right now, and the Patriots do a great job, obviously, of making the best players on the Dolphins and the rest of the NFL win from week to week, and try to have you win with your worst players, basically. So Mike Gesicki is 536. The highest tight end seasons from the Dolphins in history. First is Randy McMichael with 791 in 2004. Second, Charles Clay in 2013 with 759. Third, Keith Jackson, 673 in 1994. Fourth, Randy McMichael, 640 in 2006. Fifth, Keith Jackson again, 613 in 1993 with Dan Marino. And sixth, Charles Clay, 605 in 2014. So there are only six seasons for the Dolphins at tight end where they've had over 600 yards receiving. And Gesicki, with a big game here, might be able to jump into that category.
He might. And I just want to go back to one thing real quick before we move on. The NFC East is all playing each other this weekend. It's Philly versus the Giants at 4:25 Eastern Time, and Washington versus Dallas at 4:25 Eastern Time. All games that I wouldn't even want to try to predict this week, because the entire NFC East is really earning that NFC least moniker. They are in a position right now where, at best, the NFC East can be won by a team with a 500 record. And At worst, it's won by a team with a 500 record. It's disgusting, and it looks potentially like it could be a division won by a losing team. I always hate that going into week 16, 17, when it looks like a team could actually have a losing record potentially and go to the damn playoffs. That's just disgusting to me. But anyway, no, I agree with you. I'd love to see Gesicki jump into that conversation. But I do have to say as well, no matter whether he does or does not jump into that conversation, this season has to be seen as a win for Mike Gesicki. He's a guy that we've all wanted to step up. I know I've been very vocal about earlier in the season wanting to see more from him. He's not a blocking tight end. I'm under no illusion there. It's, if it comes down to a 50-yard play downfield a la Devontae Parker, and Mike Gesicki's down there and Parker's got somebody trailing him, don't expect Gesicki to be the guy that makes the block. Even if he tries, it's adorable when he tries sometimes. It just doesn't work. He has no ability to hit an opposing player whatsoever. And it's silly when he tries. And that's not who he is, though. We know what he is. He's a mismatch piece.
And Gesicki, if Gesicki on an ongoing basis is going to be a 600 to 800 yard receiving tight end, and he's playing detached from the line a lot, I'm fine with him not being a very good blocker. I think our point coming out of the draft was he better be that type of receiver in the NFL if that's the case, and we had our doubts about that because we thought his athleticism was a little bit overrated. I still think it kind of is, but he has shown the ability to make a lot of great contested catches. He did that at Penn State too. I didn't know if that would transfer as well to the NFL level, but it has, and I'm very happy to see it. And that also shows too with Ryan Fitzpatrick that the value of putting him back in instead of Josh Rosen, because if Rosen had been thrown in there all year and said sink or swim, then we may not be talking about Parker and Gesicki as the players that they are now. And speaking of Ryan Fitzpatrick, at quarterback, last game against the Patriots, 11 for 21 for 89 yards, 3 interceptions, no points scored in a 43-0 Patriots rout. Since then, when you look at Ryan Fitzpatrick's statistics on the year, since the Patriots game in week 2, 258 for 411, so completing 62.8% of his passes, 2,935 yards passing, 18 touchdowns, 9 interceptions, so a 2-to-1 touchdown-interception ratio, 214 rushing yards, and 3 more touchdowns. So you're talking about somebody here who has been one of the big – he just wins Dolphins MVP, very well deserved. And look, I think if all goes well, and the Dolphins are going to have a different starting quarterback heading into 2020. But it's good to know at least that the Dolphins don't have to bend over backwards and try to find anybody to play the position like they were doing this past offseason.
I'm with you there. Fitzpatrick has proven me pretty wrong thus far. He's a guy that we all know. There's memes out there about the cycle of Ryan Fitzpatrick. He's somebody that typically in the past has played in waves, and really this season he's been solid overall. It was a rough start, but it was a rough start across the board. That typically will happen with a new coaching regime on a rebuilding team. And Fitzpatrick has really proven himself with this team, with these players, with this staff. And you look back, I believe it was right before the Jets win. One thing I do want to point out here, there's a great article, I believe it was in the Herald, about the turning point in the season came the day after a really moving speech from Carl Durrell, who was with the Dolphins back in 2011 when they struggled and went 0 a lot. And then he basically got up and talked about what happened back then, the way they turned things around, finished the season 6-3 in the final 9 games. And the Dolphins seem to be all in. You listen to these guys talk, they don't talk like a 4-win team. And a lot of these guys won't be here next year. But everybody that's returning is only going to help the culture for next year with free agents, with rookies, you name it, because it sounds like everyone in that building is all in on this system, on this process, you name it. So I'm excited for that. I really am, and it'd be really great if they went out with that win over the Pats tomorrow.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. And what I like about what I've been reading is that Brian Flores and company's a very effective technique that he learned from Bill Belichick. Throughout the week, he goes up to the players and he said, here's the situation. What would you do? And you better give him a good answer or he's going to think you're not prepared for the game and he's going to ream you out on it. It seems very common sense, but it's something I don't think a lot of coaches do. And you can see it on Sunday playing situational football where players are where they're supposed to be. We've seen on defense over the last 10 years with Burke and Kevin Coyle and Vance Joseph, defensively it seems like these players can't think on their own. But we haven't seen that really on defense. So kudos to this coaching staff. I like what I see so far. I can't wait until the Dolphins acquire talent and we start seeing him try to get from a 4-win team to an 8-win team to a playoff team. That's when it's going to get really interesting. But Paul, as far as Albert Wilson is concerned here, so my hope right now is that Albert Wilson, plays a great game here and he agrees to a pay cut in the offseason and I think for the patience the Dolphins showed over the last 2 years. I mean, he missed the last 10 games and then really up until 3 weeks ago, he was averaging 5.5 yards a catch. And the Dolphins still continued to put him in the game plan, even though they had wide receivers on the back end of the roster that were stepping up. So I hope he's back, and I hope he takes a pay cut to stay. But if he refuses that pay cut, the Dolphins can save $9.5 million by cutting him next year. Would you do that, or would you hang on to him?
Here's the thing. I don't think approaching a player, asking them to take a pay cut going into next season is going to be well received, and here's why.
Hold on. Let me rephrase that. Albert Wilson. Let's say Albert Wilson has a good game here, third in a row. Say is 7 catches, 80 yards, and then this upcoming off season, the Dolphins are looking at their roster, and then they go to Albert Wilson to take a pay cut from where they could otherwise save $9.5 million. Would you keep Albert Wilson at that same price tag, or would you make the cut?
No, I know exactly where you're going with this, but it's something that I've got to preface here. It's when you're a team that's walking into the offseason with a speculated 120 to 150 million in cap space, I mean, something that, in all honesty, unless you're just going on a damn shopping spree in free agency and buying things you don't need or want, just to spend the money, walking up to a veteran like Albert Wilson and asking him to take a pay cut from, I believe his cap number for next year is $8 million, correct? Is that roughly what it is?
According to an article from Barry Jackson, the Dolphins can save $9.5 million by cutting it.
Right. I think that's over the next 2 years, if I'm correct. But regardless, he's under $10 million a year. He's a guy that's shown he can produce, and there is the injury worry. And walking up to him and asking him to take a pay cut when you've got an absolute treasure chest sitting there ready to spend on players anyway. If they go out and they spend the money, you can't hit him right away with this. You just can't. If they go out and they spend a bunch of money in free agency, that cap number has shrunken down at this point. And then at that point they want to approach him about a pay cut, it's going to be a lot more well received. If they hit him right at the start of free agency and say, hey, Albert, we've got $150 million in cap money out there, and we'd really like it to be, either $155 million or $153 million, or it's going to be $159.5 million. Which one's it going to be? That, and they may not approach it that way, but his agent sitting at the table is going to go, dude, you have $150 million in cap space, and you're quibbling over this $2 to $3 million from a guy that's shown he can produce. He's just been hurt. No, we're not taking that. And you're going to potentially hurt yourself visibly with the players more so than that $2 or $3 million that you're going to save is worth. And if from a talent perspective they want to part ways, I get it. If from an injury history perspective they want to part ways, I get it. If we were talking about a $15 million a year wide receiver that we need to dial it back on, I get it. But sub $10 million a year with the talent level Albert Wilson has, keep him or cut him at this point, or wait until you need the cap space to make that adjustment.
If that's the scenario, and whether it's $8 or $9.5 million, I'm still making that cut. To be quite honest with you, because I think you can stick somebody in there at a fraction of that cost, and it's a very deep wide receiver class. What I don't want to have happen is you cut Albert Wilson over, when you do have the money that you talked about, and then you turn around and say, well, now we got to replace Albert Wilson, so we got to take a wide receiver here in the second round. That's what I would be upset with. If you're gonna cut him, then you better replace him for very cheap, because that's the point. And you're right, the Dolphins have all the money in the world, but I also think too that if you're talking about keeping a guy instead of saving $8 to $9.5 million, I'm not keeping somebody of Albert Wilson's caliber. He's a good player, but I don't think he's a great player. And if he's had any injury problems, he becomes a useless player. So that's where I stand on that. Overall, I think he's good. I'd like for him to take a pay cut, come back next year for the Dolphins to work it out. And I actually think that Albert Wilson owes that to the Dolphins for the patience that they've shown with him. But if you flat out ask him for a pay cut after he's worked all his way back to get back to the player that you expected him to be, and now he's there and he's still in his prime, and then you cut him, it'll go back to, well, why'd you sign this guy in the first place a couple of years ago? So I know it was a different regime, but point still stands. So anyway, got off track there. Paul, a lot of different things we can talk about here in the offseason. Patriots are favored by 16 points here in New England. The Dolphins roster is very depleted. The Patriots are not a team that exactly chokes in the final week when they're really playing for something. And Tom Brady has never lost to the Dolphins in Foxborough, and again, that he started from beginning to end. So I know you want the Dolphins to win, but I'm going to ask you to think with your brain, not your heart here. What's your prediction for the game?
Well, the way that you beat the Patriots this year is different than in years past. you want the ball in Tom Brady's hands. You want him throwing the ball, and you've got the one big thing that's the same is you've got to hit him early and often. Unfortunately, I think the Dolphins are too depleted to hit him early and often, and you have to play mistake-free football. Unless Miami pulls out something wildcatish that the Patriots are not expecting and have no answers for, I see the Patriots winning this one. I think it's going to be closer than people expect, but 23-13 New England.
Yeah, I'm going to go with 35-17 New England in this one. I think it's important that Ryan Fitzpatrick and Devontae Parker connect at least several times, and the Dolphins put points on the board, because the momentum you have going into the offseason is that Ryan Fitzpatrick, this led offense, does put points on the board. They have surprised people. But if you look at the end of the year and say, okay, well, the best team in your division, you played them 2 games, you threw 7 interceptions and only scored 7 points in 2 games. That, I think that's something that's going to stick out like a sore thumb. So I think that 35-17 would be a reasonable type of game, especially if the Dolphins put up some points on the board. The point spread is 16. The Dolphins have been known to cover that, so let's see if they do here in this game. And that will be our final wrap-up of a game here in the 2019 season. It is a grind. We all know that as Dolphins fans. You can follow Paul and I on Facebook, Twitter, Spreaker, iTunes, YouTube, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And you can follow us personally on Twitter at Brian Cat and Fanatic_pick. And if it's not on the right side and it's not on the left side, it is on the fin side. Solo D, take us home.
It ain't the left side or the right side, and it must be the fin side. It ain't the left side or the right side, and it must be the fin side. Listen, Dolphins fans across the land all tuning in to see what